A merchant's whip cracks, a boy's ribs show, and a stolen loaf of bread is worth more than a life. In the heart of a bustling harvest fair, a single act of kindness sets off a chain of events that will forge a hero, ignite a rebellion, and change a kingdom forever. But a good deed comes with a heavy price. One man's compassion is another's treason, and a debt repaid in silver is often settled in blood. Will a blacksmith's sacrifice be enough to save a boy he barely knows? And when the price of freedom is paid in fire and iron, who will be left to tell the tale? The harvest fair burst open in the square like a cracked pomegranate, scarlet banners snapping against a cobalt sky, fiddles shrieking over the lowing of penned cattle, and the air so thick with wood smoke and caramelized onions it turned the late September sunlight bronze. Between two ale tents, a ring of onlookers closed around a spectacle that had nothing to do with juggling or bear baiting. A merchant in saffron silk had cornered a boy no older than 15 against the wheel of a grain cart. The boy's ribs showed through a tunic that might once have been blue, now the color of dishwater. His bare feet were gray with dust, and in his arms he clutched a stolen loaf still steaming from the baker's oven. The merchant's whip cracked an inch from the boy's cheek, flicking a bead of blood onto the crust. "Hands off what's mine, gutter rat," the merchant hissed, teeth bright as fresh shucked corn. Coins clinked against the silver buckle at his waist, enough, perhaps, to feed the boy for a month. The crowd murmured, half pity, half hunger of their own. No one stepped forward. Then the forge bell rang. A single, deliberate note cut through the fair's uproar. Heads turned toward the sound as if pulled by invisible strings. From the direction of the blacksmith's stall strode a man built like the anvil he'd left cooling. Shoulders broad enough to carry a yoke, arms ridged from years of beating iron into obedience. Soot streaked his forearms like war paint. Sparks still glowed on the leather apron slung across his chest. He moved with the patient certainty of hammer meeting steel. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Enough," he said, and the word landed between merchant and boy like a thrown gauntlet. The merchant's eyes narrowed. "This is none of your trade, Smith. The whelp stole bread." "Bread he'll pay for," the blacksmith replied. He reached into the pouch at his belt and drew out a silver coin, 1 day's wage for a day's labor, then flicked it so it spun, ringing into the dust at the merchant's feet. "There's your coin. Now unclench your fist before I unclench it for you." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed. The merchant's knuckles whitened on the whip handle, but the blacksmith's gaze never wavered. It was the look a man gives iron when he knows exactly where to strike. For a heartbeat, the merchant measured profit against humiliation, then spat into the dirt beside the coin. "Keep your charity. Next time the brat steals, I'll take the hand, not the loaf." He turned on his heel, silk flaring like a wounded peacock, and the ring of spectators parted to let him pass. Silence pooled where drama had been. The boy stood trembling, loaf clutched to his chest as if it were a shield. The blacksmith crouched, bringing his face level with the boy's. Up close, the smith's eyes were the color of storm-wet slate, flecked with gold like sparks frozen mid-flight. "What's your name, lad?" The boy swallowed. "They call me Crow, on account of the dark hair. Hunger makes thieves of us all," the blacksmith said softly. "But a blade taken in need is still a blade. You owe the bread, and you owe yourself better uses for your hands." He reached out, not for the loaf but for the boy's wrist. Calloused fingers closed around thin bone with surprising gentleness. "Come. My forge is 5 streets west. There's work if you want it, and porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in." The boy Crow looked past him at the retreating merchant, then at the faces in the crowd already turning back to their revels. In his eyes something ancient flickered. Not gratitude alone, but recognition, as if he had been waiting lifetimes for this exact moment. He tucked the loaf beneath one arm and slipped his other hand into the blacksmith's palm. Together they walked against the tide of revelers, the smith's shadow falling long over the boy's smaller one, 2 silhouettes stitched by sunset until they might have been a single figure, forged from iron and dusk. Behind them the fair rolled on, but the music sounded thinner, the laughter forced. Somewhere in the distance a raven cried once, sharp as a hammer on anvil, and the wind carried the scent of coming rain. The harvest moon had barely cleared the treetops when the soldiers came. They arrived in pairs, boots ringing against the cobbles like hammer blows, lantern lights sliding over polished breastplates. The blacksmith had just banked his forge for the night, coals glowing the color of a dying heart. He was wiping soot from his hands when the first gauntlet fist struck his door. "By order of Lord Rathburn," the captain announced, voice flat as a blade against stone. "You are bound for questioning." Behind him the merchant, saffron silk replaced by midnight velvet, smiled the thin smile of a creditor who already holds the collateral. In his gloved hand he twirled the same silver coin the blacksmith had tossed at his feet 2 days earlier, now an accusation rather than payment. The charge was treason. The proof was rumor sharpened into spear point. Harboring thieves, inciting unrest, daring to raise a hand above one's station. The blacksmith's apprentices scattered like startled sparrows. The sheriff, whose own plowshares had been mended free of charge, stared at the ground. They put iron on his wrists while the forge still hissed. The metal was cold, colder than any iron he had ever shaped, and it bit the skin with the same indifferent hunger that fire showed wood. He looked for the boy Crow, but the alleyway behind the smithy was empty except for wind and the long, echoing cry of a night bird. One soldier shoved him forward. "Move, traitor." The word struck harder than the gauntlet. Traitor. To whom? To a lord who taxed bread and called it justice? To a merchant who measured worth only in coin? He tasted blood where his lip had split against his teeth and kept walking, chains chiming like broken bells. By morning the fairgrounds had transformed into courtroom. The same square that had stank of ale and sawdust now reeked of fear. Market stalls became stocks. The grain cart served as makeshift gallows, its new beam still weeping sap. Townsfolk who had cheered the blacksmith's strength now watched from shuttered windows, afraid to meet his eyes. Lord Rathburn sat beneath a canopy of crimson silk, his face carved from winter stone. The merchant lounged at his right hand, idly cleaning his nails with a dagger tip. Between them a parchment lay unfurled, red wax seal already cracked. "3 witnesses," the herald proclaimed, "swear the blacksmith gave coin to a known thief." Known thief. The boy's name was never spoken, yet it hung in the air like smoke. The blacksmith felt the weight of every gaze that had watched him by that loaf, every hand that had passed the silver coin along. No one stepped forward to speak the rest of the story, how the boy had been starving, how the merchant's price for bread was a child's broken fingers. The verdict came swift as a headsman's axe. Guilty. Penance. The full penalty for sedition, confiscation of forge, tools, and liberty. The blacksmith's anvil would be melted into shackles, his bellows sold to pay the Lord's tax, and the man himself would hang at dawn 3 days hence, an example scrawled across the sky. They dragged him past his own smithy one last time. The forge had gone dark, coals smothered under a boot heel of authority. Wind rattled the sign above the door, 2 crossed hammers painted blood-red by sunrise. On the threshold lay a single black feather, slick with dew, bending in the breeze yet refusing to fly. He almost smiled. Almost, because in that moment, with the taste of iron on his tongue and the future narrowing to the width of a rope, he remembered the boy's eyes, storm-gray, flecked with gold like sparks frozen in flight. A promise had passed between them, unspoken and unbreakable. The dungeon smelled of damp straw and rust. Shackles bolted him to a wall where centuries of prisoners had scraped tally marks of despair. Somewhere above, boots marched in measured rhythm, 1, 2, 3, counting down the hours until the scaffold. On the second night, the jailer found the cell door ajar, lock intact but strangely warm. The blacksmith sat unmoved, chains still clasped around his wrists yet resting loose upon the stone. Between his feet lay another black feather, this one tipped with crimson as though dipped in forge fire. No key had been turned, no bars bent. Only the scent of smoke lingered, wood smoke, not straw, and the faintest echo of a hammer striking iron in the distance. The jailer crossed himself and said nothing. He locked the door again, hands trembling, and did not report the impossible. Dawn of the third day arrived with drums and the creak of fresh rope. The scaffold rose against a sky the color of beaten steel. Townsfolk gathered, not cheering, not weeping, simply present, as if witnessing the slow collapse of something larger than one man. As they led the blacksmith up the steps, he scanned the crowd. No sign of the boy, only ravens wheeling overhead, black wings slicing sunlight into ribbons. The hangman fitted the noose, coarse fibers rasping against the blacksmith's beard. Far below, a single figure stepped from the shadow of the grain cart. Cloaked in midnight wool, hood pulled low, the newcomer moved with the fluid certainty of a blade leaving its sheath. One hand rose, fingers splayed, a gesture the blacksmith alone could read. Wait. The drums faltered. Somewhere in the distance, iron rang against iron like a bell tolling for the condemned, or for the dawn. The blacksmith closed his eyes, tasted smoke and promise, and felt the rope slacken just enough to breathe. Not yet, the gesture said. Not yet. Winter came first, and the blacksmith's world shrank to the size of a heartbeat. They exiled him not beyond walls but within them. A ruined watchtower on the northern ridge, its stones cracked by frost and older griefs. The Lord's sentence was a mockery. No bars, only wind sharp enough to skin wolves. Each dawn the blacksmith dragged a sled of scrap iron across frozen ruts, feeding the tower's single brazier until the metal glowed like captive sunrise. Sparks rose, kissed the open sky, and fell back as brief, bright stars that died before touching earth. He shaped nothing useful, no horseshoes, no plowshares, only nails. Hundreds of them, thousands. He drove each nail into the tower's beams with the fury of a man trying to pin the world together. Spring leaked in through cracks the nails could not close. Thaw revealed the first rumor. A merchant caravan ambushed on the southern road. Guards found bound with their own belts, bread and coin left untouched beside them. The only clue, a single black feather driven point first into a wagon board. The blacksmith heard the tale from a charcoal burner who traded nails for fuel. When the man spoke Crow's name, half whisper, half curse, the blacksmith's hammer paused mid-strike. A spark landed on his wrist, burned, and he welcomed it as proof he still felt pain. Summer brought drought. Crops withered, wells sank, and the Lord's taxmen grew crueler. Yet every burned barn, every emptied granary, carried the same signature. Doors splintered from within, chains snapped as if pried by invisible pincers, and always that single feather, now crimson-tipped, as though dipped in forge fire. Rumors braided into legend. The Raven Captain, a ghost in midnight mail, striking only the unjust, vanishing before dawn. The blacksmith listened, said nothing, and filed the edge of a dagger he had no right to own. On the hottest night of the year, he woke to find the tower door ajar and a fresh feather resting on his anvil, still warm. Autumn returned with the scent of apples and betrayal. The Lord's levies doubled. Men disappeared from fields and were found weeks later, faces turned to the sky in silent accusation. Refugees spoke of a hidden camp in the high forests. No banners, no songs, only the ring of hammers after dark and the smell of coal smoke drifting like incense. One night the blacksmith's brazier spat a tongue of blue flame that shaped itself into a raven mid-flight before collapsing into embers. He stared until the glow hurt his eyes, then laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. He began to forge again, not nails but links. Each link was small, perfect, and cold to the touch until he breathed on it and it seemed to remember fire. Snow returned early, soft as ash. On the longest night of the year, the tower door opened without wind. Footsteps, light, deliberate, crossed the threshold. The blacksmith did not turn. He knew the cadence of those steps the way a smith knows the heartbeat of his forge. A gloved hand settled on his shoulder, weightless yet heavier than iron. In the brazier's light, the newcomer's shadow stretched wings across the wall. "Old friend," a voice said, "older now, tempered by battles unnamed. I have need of your craft." The blacksmith set down his hammer. After 7 winters, the chains he had forged were not for binding but for bridging. He turned, and the boy once called Crow stood before him, no longer ragamuffin but warrior. Cloak of midnight wool, eyes storm gray flecked with gold, and at his throat a torque of black iron shaped like interlocking feathers. Behind him, muffled by snow, a score of silent figures waited, refugees, outlaws, men and women whose faces carried the same brand of exile. The blacksmith opened his mouth, found no words, and closed it again. Crow smiled, thin, fierce, unchanged at the edges, and pressed something into his palm. The first nail the blacksmith had ever given him, now honed to a needle's point and strung on a leather cord. "You kept my promise," Crow said. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Somewhere in the valley below, the Lord's gallows stood empty, rope creaking in the wind. The blacksmith closed his fist around the nail and felt the tower walls tremble. Not with cold, but with the distant thunder of anvils waking after long silence. He reached for his hammer, and the sparks that rose were no longer brief stars dying in the dark, but the first light of a dawn he had stopped daring to hope for. Dawn bled across the scaffold in thin red streaks, as though the sky itself had been flogged through the night. The blacksmith stood on the raw pine platform, wrists bound behind him, the hemp noose kissing the sweat at his throat. Below, the square was a cauldron of frost and faces, hundreds pressed shoulder to shoulder, breath pluming white, eyes bright with dread or hunger. Children clutched their mother's skirts. Old men chewed toothless curses. A single drum kept time. Thud, thud, thud. Slow as a dying heart. Lord Rathburn lounged beneath a crimson canopy, wolf pelt cloak draped over velvet, face carved from winter marble. At his right, the merchant, now clad in sable, polished his dagger with a silk rag, lips curved in the small, satisfied smile of a man who had wagered correctly and come to collect. Between them, the parchment of condemnation fluttered in the wind, the wax seal already split like a broken oath. The drum ceased. "Let the traitor meet the justice he forged," the herald cried, voice cracking on the last word. The executioner stepped forward, hooded, axe catching the first spear of sunlight. He smelled of sour ale and yesterday's blood. The blacksmith lifted his chin. He felt the noose tighten with the motion, coarse fibers rasping skin already rubbed raw. He thought of the tower, of nails hammered into beams like prayers, of the boy who had once taken a coin and a loaf and vanished into legend. He thought, absurdly, of sparks, those brief fierce stars that lived only in the moment of their birth and died before they touched earth. Then he closed his eyes and waited for the drop. A horn sounded. Not the flat, official blast of Rathburn's guard, but the wild, mournful note of something older. Heads swiveled. Somewhere beyond the square, horses screamed. The drum that had been silent now stuttered, uncertain. The executioner hesitated. The first arrow took the drumskin. It punched through with a wet thud, silencing the heartbeat. Before the echo died, a second arrow sheared the rope above the blacksmith's head. The noose sagged, slack as an unkept promise. Panic rippled outward like rings in a pond. Soldiers surged toward the scaffold, swords half drawn. But the crowd had become a living thing, pressing, surging, splitting apart. A hooded rider burst through the breach on a stallion black as midnight oil. The rider's cloak snapped behind him like wings. In his left hand he held a shortbow, in his right a blade that caught sunrise and threw it back as lightning. Crow. Not the ragged boy who had once clutched a stolen loaf, but the raven captain. Male dark as storm cloud, torque of interlocking feathers gleaming at his throat. His eyes, storm gray flecked with gold, found the blacksmiths across the chaos and held them for a single, weightless heartbeat. "Down," he said, not shouted, merely spoken, and the blacksmith dropped to his knees as a third arrow whistled overhead to bury itself in the breast of the nearest guard. The stallion reared, iron-shod hooves sparking against the scaffold's edge. Crow leapt, landing cat-light beside the blacksmith. A dagger flashed, rope parted like rotted twine. Lord Rathburn rose, face purpling. Seized them, but the soldiers found themselves facing not one fugitive but scores. From every alley poured men and women cloaked in midnight wool, armed with sickles repurposed into blades, hammers balanced for war. They moved with the quiet coordination of a practiced army, not a rabble. At their head strode the charcoal burner, the baker, the sheriff who had once looked away, the entire town reborn into something sharp and unafraid. Crow pressed the dagger's hilt into the blacksmith's freed hands. "Your forge is waiting," he said, voice low enough for only them. "But first we finish what we started." Steel met steel in a brittle clang. The merchant lunged, dagger aimed for Crow's ribs, but the blacksmith, chains still trailing from his wrists, spun, bringing his forearm up to block. Bone jarred against bone. The dagger clattered to the scaffold. The blacksmith's hands remembered their craft even without fire. He seized the merchant's wrist, twisted, felt the joint give with a wet pop. The merchant screamed, high and thin. Around them the fight contracted into a storm of grit and blood. A soldier's blade sliced Crow's cloak. The fabric parted to reveal mail beneath, links etched with tiny feathers. Another guard rushed the scaffold ladder. Crow's bow sang again and the man pitched backward into the crowd, swallowed by the surge. Lord Rathburn drew his own sword, a curved thing of ceremonial silver, and advanced. For a moment the world narrowed to 3 men on a platform. The lord in crimson, the smith in shackles, the ragged captain who had become legend. Rathburn lunged. Crow parried, blade ringing against silver. Sparks flew, brief fierce stars that lived only in the moment of their birth. The blacksmith saw the opening. Rathburn's guard high, ribs exposed, and moved without thinking. He stepped inside the sword's arc, shoulder driving into the lord's chest. Iron chains whipped upward, catching Rathburn's throat. 1 heartbeat, 2. Then the lord's knees buckled and he fell, ceremonial sword clattering down the scaffold steps like a dropped toy. Silence fell so sudden it felt like a second dawn. Crow lowered his bow. Around the square the midnight-cloaked fighters stood over fallen guards, chests heaving, eyes bright. The merchant cowered against the scaffold post, cradling his broken wrist. The crowd stared, not at the bodies, but at the blacksmith who had once mended their plows, now standing above their fallen lord with chains still trailing like broken reins. Crow spoke into the hush. "Justice has been served, not by rope but by choice. Any who wish to follow the old way may leave now. Those who choose the new stay." No one moved. High overhead, ravens wheeled and cried, black wings against a sky suddenly wide enough to hold futures no one had dared imagine. The blacksmith looked at Crow, saw the boy he had once fed reflected in the warrior's steady gaze, and knew the next hammer strike would shape not nails but a kingdom. Below them the scaffold creaked, empty noose swaying in the newborn wind, waiting for a dawn that would never come. Dawn lifted like a blade drawn from the forge, orange-white and humming. The square lay quiet save for the drip of blood from scaffold planks onto frozen earth. The fallen lord's cloak, red once, now darker, flapped once, surrendered, and was still. Around the platform the townsfolk stood in stunned clusters, breath fogging, eyes wide with the same wonder men feel when they witness iron first run molten. No one spoke. Even the ravens had ceased their wheeling. Crow knelt, wiped his dagger on the snow, and looked up at the blacksmith. "Your hammer," he said simply, "and your choice." The blacksmith flexed his freed wrists. The chains that had bound him now lay coiled like spent serpents, links still warm from his own pulse. He stepped down from the scaffold, boots crunching frost, and the crowd parted as though he carried fire in his hands. Somewhere behind him the merchant whimpered, cradling a broken wrist. The blacksmith did not glance back. There would be time for justice later, measured, tempered, and exact. Today there was only beginning. They walked together, smith and captain, through streets that had once known only the heel of Rathburn's rule. Shutters cracked open. Faces appeared. The baker whose shutters had closed when soldiers came, the sheriff who had looked away, children who had learned to fear the scaffold. One by one those faces softened from dread to dawning hope. A girl no older than 8 darted forward, pressed a single black feather into the blacksmith's palm, and fled, cheeks bright with courage. By the time they reached the ruined watchtower, The sun had climbed high enough to gild every scar on the stones. The forge inside was cold, the coals long dead, but the anvil waited patient, unjudging. Crow set a hand upon it, tracing the dents left by thousands of hammer blows. 7 winters, he said. I counted every nail you drove for me. The blacksmith exhaled a laugh that tasted of smoke and relief. And I every feather you left in my path. They worked without ceremony. The blacksmith rebuilt the fire. Crow fed it pine and oak until the flames roared like approval. Between them passed no speeches, only the familiar rhythm. Iron in, iron out, sparks spiraling into daylight like fledgling stars. The first thing forged was not a weapon but a torque. A circle of black iron hammered into the shape of outstretched wings. When it cooled, Crow clasped it around the blacksmith's neck. It fit as though it had always belonged there. By evening the tower yard filled with people. They came carrying what they could. A sack of grain, a goat kid, a child's wooden sword painted blue. They came with questions in their eyes and answers forming on their tongues. The blacksmith laid his hands on the anvil and spoke. Not as lord, not as hero, but as a man who knew the weight of metal and the weight of promises. We will not build walls to keep fear out, he said. We will build bridges strong enough to carry it away. Crow stepped forward, cloak stirring in the wind. Every pair of hands here is a hammer, every heart a bellows. From this night on, no chain will be forged unless it is meant to lift a burden, not bind a soul. A murmur rose, not of obedience but of recognition. The baker offered flour. The sheriff offered his badge melted into plowshares. Children offered laughter that rang like bells. Someone began to sing, low at first, then swelling. A tune older than lords, older than scaffolds. By the time the moon cleared the ridge, the song had become a chorus, and the chorus had become a heartbeat. They worked through the night. By torchlight the blacksmith shaped scythes and plows, hinges and cauldrons. Crow and his fighters hammered mail into harvest hooks, melted sword hilts into pruning knives. A girl with soot on her cheeks learned to strike steel true. An old man learned to quench blades in salt water so they would neither crack nor rust. The tower that had once been a prison became a hearth, its stones drinking in heat and giving back light. Toward dawn, the blacksmith set the last piece upon the anvil. A tiny nail, no longer than a finger joint, its head stamped with the outline of a raven in flight. He held it up to the first pale light. For the door of the first free house, he said. Crow took the nail and pressed it into the girl's hand, the same girl who had given the feather. Drive it when you are ready, he told her. And remember, every hammer strike is a promise kept. The sun rose full and fierce, gilding the tower, the square, the dismantled scaffold beyond. Somewhere down the valley, a rooster crowed. Not the strangled cry of a bird kept under curfew, but the wild, jubilant note of a creature that knows the world has turned. The blacksmith wiped sweat from his brow and looked at Crow. Side by side they stood, 2 silhouettes against the forge glow. One broad as an anvil, the other tall as a spear of winter pine. Between them stretched the road they had yet to travel. Not paved with gold but laid rail by rail with iron they had themselves tempered. Far above, ravens wheeled and banked, black wings slicing the newborn light. One bird dipped low, dropped another feather, this one white at the tip, as though dipped in the first snow of a year that had not yet come. It landed on the anvil and did not burn. The blacksmith picked it up, turned it in calloused fingers, and smiled the first unguarded smile of 7 winters. Ready? Crow asked. The blacksmith closed his fist around the feather and the promise it carried. We have always been ready, he said. Now we begin. Behind them the forge roared like a living thing, and the road stretched on wide, unmarked, ringing with the echo of hammers that would never again be stilled.